Okay, I'm going to try this again because this didn't quite work out the way that I had hoped earlier. Didn't seem like my microphone was working properly. So I'm going to try and do this again, but maybe make it a little bit shorter and a little bit easier to understand. When we think about the reign of King Henry VIII, there comes to mind quite a few well-known names at court at the time. When I think of it, the first names that come to mind are going to be the Howards, obviously, started hi, Christine. I'm so glad that everybody can hear me this time. I haven't quite figured out the whole microphone thing. So I'm going to try this all over again and we'll just kind of go from there. So when we think about the reign of Henry VIII, we think of big family names like the Howards, the Boleyns, the Poles. Who else do we think of? The Seymours is another one. Maybe we get the Parrs in there as well. Who else am I thinking of here? I'm totally drawing. The Cromwells, the Staffords, the Brandons. And those are some of the well-known names. And most of the time when we think of those well-known names, we think of the men, because the men are the ones that were more written about. Unless you were a queen consort, we didn't really get to hear much about you. So when it comes to the Howards, we think of, Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk. We think of Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey. And Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, is an interesting character to me. And I call them characters. Obviously, they were people, but he is an interesting character to me. And I want to talk a little bit about this book by Jesse Childs. Hopefully you can see this here. It's Henry VIII's Last Victim. And it is The Life and Times of Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey. The reason why I purchased this book was because I was doing research on Thomas Seymour, and I knew that Thomas Seymour and Henry Howard had been friends for a time, and that Henry Howard had nominated Thomas Seymour to the Order of the Garter, which kind of surprised me because in portrayals that we saw in the Tudors, Henry Howard talked about the Seymours being upstarts and, of low birth and stuff like that. So when I think of the Howards, I think of those two. That's the only book that I really have on the Howards. But if we look at, let's say, the Brandons, I don't really have much either when it comes to the Brandons, but Sarah Bryson, who wrote this book, Lorraine Blanche, she's working on a book right now about the Brandon men that is going to be out in 2020, I believe. And if I know anything about Sarah's research and writing, it's going to be very well researched. I know she's been working on this book for a long time, and you won't be disappointed when it comes to that. Another big name, obviously, is going to be the Boleyns. Most of us know who Anne Boleyn was. She was the second wife of King Henry VIII. Anne Boleyn, there are so many books about her, and it might be hard to decide which ones to start with. And I have a whole pile of books here, and it takes forever to go through these. So Eric Ives' book, to me, is the Bible when it comes to Anne Boleyn. I highly recommend that you start there. Elizabeth Norton has written something on her. There are so many that are available. David Lodes is another great author. I don't remember for sure if he did an Anne Boleyn book or not. It seems like anybody who's ever written about the Tudors has done a book on Anne Boleyn. From there, another big name to me, obviously, is the Seymours because of the third wife of Henry VIII, Jane Seymour. She, if you don't know, is the one that gave birth to the future Edward VI and then died, I think it was like 12 days later. And she died of puerperal fever. Some allege that she may have died from food poisoning or something else. Regardless, she died. And poor Edward VI was raised without his mother. And he was kind of coddled in life, very much like Henry VIII was. He was surrounded by women and was given everything he ever wanted. And I think he would have become a lot like Henry VIII had he reigned for his full term, for his entire life. He was spoiled, and he was treated, I feel like, a delicate piece of ceramic or glass, or he was treated in a way that there's no surprise that he was the way that he was. But I do believe that he really loved his sisters, and He was very religious. I think he would have been a good king. I think he would have been a good king. But maybe his uncle Edward wanted the kingship more. And he kind of was able to guide the kingdom in the way that he wanted to and make religion the way that he wanted it. And maybe a way that Cromwell would have wished that it had turned out. And speaking of Cromwell, that's another big name. And Thomas Cromwell rose up through the channels at Tudor court. You know, he had worked for Thomas Wolsey. And after Wolsey's downfall and death, he kind of replaced him in a sense and was able to placate Henry VIII and was able to make some reforms himself through Henry VIII for religion so that Henry could marry Anne Boleyn. I'm reading a book right now by Tracy Borman, her new one, Henry VIII and the Men Who Made Him. It is an absolutely fantastic book. I cannot recommend it enough. I always feel like I've read so many books on Henry VIII that there's nothing that you could tell me new. So why would I buy this book? But this book really has opened my eyes to a lot of the men who surrounded the king and who tried to guide him in a way to make the kingdom better than it already was, or to save the kingdom in a sense. But Henry really had his mindset on what he wanted as he got older. When he was younger with Wolsey, Wolsey was really able to guide him and teach him and control him a little bit more. And I think after Wolsey's downfall, Henry saw things differently. And he wanted to have more control because everybody kept saying Wolsey had so much control over the kingdom that he was almost king de facto. So this book by Tracy Borman, I highly recommend it. I think I have about 100 pages left, and I've just been reading it as I can here and there, you know, on breaks at work or in the evening or lying in bed at night and reading whenever I can. It is fantastic. I really recommend that you read that. Who are some of the other big names? The Poles, obviously, when we think of the Poles, the first person that comes to mind is Margaret Pole. And if you don't know, Margaret Pole by birth was a Plantagenet. She was the daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, who was the younger brother of King Edward IV, and Richard III is in there as well. So if I remember correctly, he's in between Edward IV and Richard III age. But unfortunately, he was rather ambitious, and he was executed under the reign of his brother Edward IV. And his wife, Isabel Neville, who was Margaret's mother, had died prior to that, which may have led him to go a little bit mad. And he always seemed to want to grasp for power. He felt like he deserved things. And he had men around him like the Kingmaker, who helped make Edward IV king, who didn't like the way Edward IV was doing things. And so tried to get his brother George on the throne instead. So Margaret Pole is the daughter of those two great names, the Nevilles and the Plantagenets, the Duke of Clarence. And she was seen as a York. So during the reign of Henry VII, the Yorks were kind of a threat to Henry's throne, even though he had married Elizabeth of York to kind of cease the Wars of the Roses, because these wars had gone on for decades, and it was time that they end. All these people had to live in fear, and they had to go to sanctuary. And so Margaret's life was essentially, I would say, lived in fear. She lived at court with her cousin Elizabeth of York, and her brother Edward, the Earl of Warwick, was with her. And unfortunately, Edward, Earl of Warwick, was also seen as a threat to the throne. And so he was kind of locked away for a while, a long time, actually. And there were a lot of people who thought that his cousins, the princes in the Tower, were murdered by Richard III, and that maybe the younger of the two princes, Richard, who was Duke of York, actually survived, that he was switched for, just a subject of England. And so when Perkin Warbeck showed up, he claimed to be Richard. And that really set off a chain of events, which ultimately led to Perkin Warbeck's execution. But not only his, also Edward, the Earl of Warwick, who was Margaret Pole's younger brother. So you can imagine we've kind of seen this in The Spanish Princess a little bit about Margaret Pole and her grief over the loss of her brother and how it was unfair. We don't know, exactly all the stuff that happened during that time. All we have are the letters and the documents and stuff that we can make decisions off of. If I had been Henry VII and the Earl of Warwick was a threat to my throne as well, and with him being alive, he had to make the decision that he had to make. And because, the Earl of Warwick was executed, doesn't necessarily mean that Henry VII was a bad king. It just means he had to do what he had to do to secure his own dynasty. And he did it. And we don't know whether or not he regretted it or how Elizabeth of York for sure felt about it. But it was what it was, and it helped him secure his throne. But that kind of carried over then into the reign of his son, Henry VIII, and the threats to his throne. We have Edward de la Pole. He had to execute, I think it was in 1513, because he was a threat. And then later on, we're into 1530s, late 1530s, the Pilgrimage of Grace, and we start seeing the Poles come under fire because of Reginald Pole. And Reginald Pole was adamantly against Henry VIII's decisions when it came to the church. And he saw what Henry was doing was going in the wrong direction. And so he spoke out against Henry VIII and how he was handling things, which in turn really threatened his family's security. So as we know, he had two brothers who were arrested. I believe they were both executed. His mother was sent to the Tower. She was the oldest woman executed at the Tower. And it was sad because did she deserve to be executed? It seems like maybe she didn't, but maybe she did have some ill feelings toward the way the things were going in the kingdom. And as you all know, you weren't allowed to have an opinion when it came to those things under the reign of most kings, not just Henry VIII. So anyway, if you're looking for a book on Margaret Pole, the only recommendation that I have is one that I have read. And if I can find it here, I'll see if I can share. Oh, here it is. Okay. That is, that was backwards and upside down. Margaret Pole by Susan Higginbotham. I would recommend it. It's not super thick. It's a good read. And it's good to know her story, to understand Margaret's role in the Tudor dynasty, because I think it's important to understand how all of these women affected the future when it came to the reign of Henry VIII. Yes, Christine, she was an old lady, and I believe she was maybe in her 70s when she was executed. She may have been in her 60s. I'm trying to remember, but it was old for the time because the lifespan during that time was not as long as it is now. Once you reached your 30s, you were considered old. You're almost a senior citizen. They didn't have the medicine and the know-how that we have today. So it was, hi, Chloe. Thanks for joining me. Do you guys, Christine and Chloe, do you have any questions? Because otherwise I'm just going to keep rambling, and I don't know if anybody cares just to hear me ramble at all. Do you have any questions about the Tudor dynasty that you've always want answered? And no question is a dumb question. And if I don't know the answer to it, I will tell you that I don't know the answer to it. So as I wait to see if anybody comes up with any questions for me, I'm going to talk about The Six Wives of Henry VIII. This book, most people would say, is like the Bible of the Six Wives by Allison Weir. It's a good read. She's very well known, so obviously a lot of people have read this one. I've really used and abused this one. I broke the spine a little bit there. The only complaint that I have are there are some items in here, some claims that Weir makes that have footnotes. And when I go to the back of the book to look at the sources that go along with those footnotes, there is nothing. And so that was a little disappointing to me because I like to learn as I read and make notes and go back and research those things that they use as footnotes and make sure my interpretation of that is going to be the same. So after I read that one, I picked up Antonia Fraser's book because everybody talks about this one being the one that you really need to read. And I really enjoyed this one. It's a little bit of a harder read. Her writing isn't as easy to read maybe as Weir's or some other historians, but you will learn a lot from this one. So if you're going to read Weir's book, I would also recommend that you read Antonia Fraser's book on the Six Wives. There are a couple other ones out there. Amy License has one on the Six Wives, as well as David Lode's. I don't have the one by David Starkey, but my opinion of David Starkey has kind of changed over the years. Let's see. Christine has a question for me. What do you think about Allison Weir's theory of Anne of Cleves given birth before him? Oh, yes. Okay, so I pre-ordered this book and it arrived, I don't know, probably like a month ago. And around the same time, I actually read Heather R. Darcy's nonfiction book. I was able to get an advanced copy of that one. And Heather Darcy's book is from the German view. So we really get to see what I would consider to be Anne of Cleves' side of the story, not the English side of the story. And I feel like what I have heard about where Allison Weir goes with the story is I'm a little upset. I feel like she's scandalizing something that doesn't even need to be scandalized. There's so much more that could have been written about Anne of Cleves. You know, we heard so many things about her being ugly, things like that. I don't know why she had to go with Anne being pregnant. And that's why her body was the way that it was. As many of us have heard already, it probably had more to do with Henry VIII than it did with Anne of Cleves. I don't think there was anything wrong with Anne of Cleves. And if you read Heather Darcy's book, Anna, Duchess of Cleves, you'll really see a different side of the story. And I highly recommend reading it. It comes out in the US on July 1st. And so pick it up, pre-order it, whatever you got to do, because you're going to be blown away by what Darcy has discovered in her research through German documents and whatnot. It's absolutely amazing. And I don't know that I could ever read another Anne of Cleves book again, because it really opened my eyes to what was going on in politics in the time and how that affected Anne's life in England and religion and politics. It really shaped that time period. I don't want to give everything away because the book was so good and I want you to read it yourself to find out more. But Weir's approach on Anne of Cleves being pregnant prior to Henry is absolutely ridiculous. It's just to sell books, and it's to scandalize the events, but it's fiction. So if you go into it knowing that it's fiction, that's great. The only thing I think a lot of us are upset about is that people look at Weir as a historian and they read these books forgetting that they're fiction. And so I am a proponent for reminding people that these are fiction books. So hopefully that answers your question. Chloe asked, did Anne Boleyn really cheat on Henry VIII? And did Anne and Elizabeth have a relationship? Well, I don't think Anne really cheated on Henry VIII. I think there was a lot that was created by Cromwell in order to instigate the fall of Anne Boleyn. There was a lot going on at that time. And as we all know, Anne was very vocal. She wasn't afraid to speak up, which in the 16th century, even as queen consort, was frowned upon. And she became, I think, a problem for Henry. And she wasn't able to provide him with the male heir that he just so desperately wanted. He created the Church of England so that he could, marry her. And I don't think she cheated on him. Of course, we don't know for sure. We don't definitely know that much. As far as whether or not Anne had a relationship with Elizabeth, I don't think it was like mothers have with their children today, as as a princess, Elizabeth would have been, separated from her mother, would have had her own household. And so, Anne would have visited her on occasions and stuff, but I don't believe it's like the loving relationship that we see in the movies and on TV. Let's see what else. Yes, Christine. Heather R. Darcy, Darsie. And I share pictures of that book a lot on my Facebook page. So if it's something that you are interested in purchasing, let me know. Send me a message on the Tudors Dynasty Facebook page, and I will send you a link to the book, because let me tell you, you are going to be blown away. And I'm really proud. Heather is a friend of mine, and I'm really proud of the research that she did trying to bring Anne's story to life. So I think it's well overdue, and it's amazing. I can't say enough about it. It was such a fantastic book. Oh yeah, Christine. Yeah, I'm not saying that she did. I'm, we just don't know for certain whether or not some of these things happen behind closed doors. And so we just have to look at the facts that are at hand. And the only facts that we have right now are what Cromwell came up with. And from there, we can just make our own choices on what we believe the character of a person was. I don't really think that Anne Boleyn had affairs. I don't really think that she slept with her brother George. Again, I think Cromwell completely fabricated the entire thing. And that's another thing that you'll read in the book by Tracy Borman, Henry VIII and the Men Who Made Him. Fantastic book. I'm got about 100 pages left on it. Another one that I would highly recommend reading. There are so many books about Henry VIII out there. I felt like I wasn't sure whether or not I wanted to buy this one because of that. But once I started reading it, I thought, okay, I'm seeing a different side of the reign of Henry VIII because of the men who surrounded him and who influenced him, and how that changed him as a king. During the early part of his reign with Wolsey by his side, Wolsey really let Henry do his own thing and kind of took charge of the kingdom for him, which, to be honest with you, was probably the best for the kingdom at the time. And once Wolsey's downfall happened, you had people like the Howards and the Duke of Suffolk, the Duke of Norfolk, the Earl of Surrey, and you had the Boleyns, who all wanted Wolsey out of the way because Wolsey wasn't able to. I know Suffolk didn't really want Wolsey out of the way. That would be incorrect. But they wanted him out of the way so that Anne could marry Henry. And they, felt like he was doing everything in his power not to make that happen. So when Cromwell came into the picture, he had to play it a little bit safer. And, Thomas Cromwell was really used and abused by Henry VIII, but he went along with it because I think he felt like he was doing what was best for the country as well. But he knew his limits to a point as well. There are quite a few books on Cromwell that I would highly recommend. I think I grabbed, again, I have like an entire stack of books here. There are quite a few biographies on Thomas Cromwell that I would highly recommend. Let's see what else we have right now. So did Margaret Beaufort really dislike Elizabeth of York? So I am no expert on Margaret Beaufort. I don't know that she disliked her because she had a part in making the marriage happen. So Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Woodville, my favorite queen consort, they kind of planned out this marriage between the couple to stop the Wars of the Roses. So I'm not sure that she disliked her. I don't know enough about Margaret Beaufort to really have an opinion. So I really don't want to answer that one because I think I'm going to upset a lot of people by answering that one and not knowing enough. Hi, Lori. Let's see. Lori says, I think Anne was an easy target for an accusation of infidelity because she's such an outwardly confident personality and was not intimidated by engaging men in a lot. Yes. She, people say she was ahead of her time. I don't know that saying that is correct, but she definitely had opinions. And I feel like Henry probably encouraged some of that because of his love for her. He liked that about her. Prior to their marriage and prior to the birth of Elizabeth, he really appreciated having somebody who maybe have been seen as an equal by his side to have these conversations with. So I can't even imagine what it would have been like to be a woman living during that time. I think I would have ended up executed in no time because we're so lucky, even though women nowadays still don't have the equal rights of men. I feel like back then, it would have been very difficult, but they didn't know any better. This is how they were raised. And I'm sure there were plenty of them who wished for more and wished to have more of an opinion. and they just educated themselves. You have Anne Boleyn having gone to Margaret of Austria when she was a teenager, which I think really opened up her mind to the world. And I think that's what helped her become more opinionated. Yes. So Christine, you said in your previous video today, my Facebook Live video, yes, you recommended a book on Edward, the Lost King. Yes. So let me, I think that was my Facebook Live video. My other one, I don't think the audio was working. So this book right here, hopefully you can see it. It's kind of got the plastic cover. Edward the King, or Edward the Sixth, The Lost King of England by Chris Skidmore. Can you see that now? It's hard to see with the plastic cover on there. This one I highly recommend. Very well researched. Like I said, I have a lot of books on Edward the Sixth. I have some really old books. I have some of his Privy Council meeting books and stuff like that, which to me was like the best find that I have ever made. So I would recommend that one as well. One, I know a lot of you are fans of Lady Jane Grey. I'm kind of all over the place right now, but I'm getting ready to kind of wrap up here very shortly. Lady Jane Grey, one of my favorite books about her is this one, The Sisters Who Would Be Queen by Leanda Delisle. I love Leanda Delisle. Her books are fantastic. She's a historian and author. I've had her as a guest blogger. You may have recently seen on my Facebook page. She did the Battle of Flodden one with Catherine of Aragon and Margaret Tudor. She is a brilliant writer. This right here is nonfiction, but it is written like fiction. It is so easy to read. It is fantastic. I would highly recommend this one. It was hard for me to find this copy. I had seen somebody on Facebook talk about this one, and so I had immediately went to go find it, which happens a lot and why my book collection is as big as it is. I had to find a used copy of this. I didn't have to pay very much. It took a long time to get to me. I think it came from England. But I would highly recommend it if you're interested in Lady Jane Grey. Another one about Lady Jane Grey is Crown of Blood by Nicola Tallis. That one is another fantastic read. Very, very well researched. So I'd recommend this one. Eric Ives, well-renowned, respected. Eric Ives also did a book on Lady Jane Grey, a Tudor mystery. Very good. This is like the Bible. As you can see, I have lots of post-it notes in here. So I would really recommend that one. Another book, I'm just jumping all around here. I would recommend this one too. Catherine Parr. This one is Complete Works and Correspondence. So this one is fantastic. If you really want to understand Catherine Parr through her own words, this is going to be the best way that you can do it. Let's see here. Could you possibly do an episode? Honey Bunny, I love that name. Could you possibly do an episode on Cromwell and the Cecils and the power that they had behind the throne? I could, yeah. I feel like I have enough books on Cromwell to be able to do it. Maybe not the Cecils, but they definitely were the power behind the throne during the reign of Elizabeth. And I have tons of Elizabeth books. And I tend to focus more on the reign of Henry VIII and Edward VI, but I have no problem learning more. So maybe one of the future ones I do here, I'll have to make a list, will be on the Cromwells, because Thomas Cromwell's son, Gregory, if you don't know, married Elizabeth Seymour, the younger sister of Edward, Thomas, and Jane Seymour. So there is an interesting tie in there. But yes, definitely. I'll add that to the list. Kelly, good morning. Thank you for joining me. I tried this at 9 o'clock and I don't think my audio was working, but now some say it was, and I ended up deleting that video. So I apologize because I recommended a lot of books in that video. But if you have any book recommendations that you're looking for, please let me know. Christine, why do you not like Starkey? I have to say, some of the things that he says in his books, I don't agree with. And it's one of those things, we can all interpret history the way that we want to. And I don't remember exactly what it was that turned me off to Starkey. But I really respected him for a very long time. I still respect him. I'm just not as big of a fan of him as I used to be. And it probably had something to do with his view on Elizabeth, Tudor and Thomas Seymour. So, anybody talks bad about Thomas Seymour, I get a little bit upset about that. But everything is open for interpretation. So I look at Thomas Seymour in a different way than most people do, because I feel like most people just look at the testimony given by Cat Ashley as fact. And, there are, what was his name? G.W. Bernard, I believe, is a professor. And he talks about in an essay that he did about Thomas Seymour about how Catherine Parr was under psychological torture in the Tower, which led to her giving the testimony that she gave against Thomas Seymour. So I keep that in mind a lot when I'm reading stuff where people are using that testimony against Thomas Seymour. I just find it unfair. I think we really need to look at the bigger picture of the time and why would these people say these things. Thomas Seymour was well liked. He was more liked than his brother Edward. And, as most of you probably know, I just feel like he kind of got the shaft. His brother treated him poorly. And that's one of the things that I really touch base on in the fiction book that I'm writing about Thomas Seymour right now is that relationship and how I see it playing out. We don't know a lot about the behind the scenes stuff. So that's a fun thing about writing fiction is you can create some of those things. But I'll have to leave that because I'm getting close to finishing my second draft. What else do we got? Christy, Allison Weir. I have a weird relationship with her stuff because her nonfiction, a lot of the time I feel like is fantastic. I think what started to turn me off was when I read The Six Wives of Henry VIII and came across something that she put down as fact with a footnote. And when I went to the back of the book to see the source that lined up with that footnote, there was no source. And I actually contacted her and asked her about it. And she just basically said, it was a long time ago. I don't remember. And I plan to reprint the book again someday. That bothered me because if you're going to put a footnote in there, I would surely hope that you have a source to match up with it because many people take nonfiction books as 100% fact, as they should be. They should be well researched. We should try hard not to put our opinions into nonfiction book, and sometimes it's hard. It's hard not to do those things. So I don't want to come down on people too hard because we all have our own tastes. We all have, things that we like and don't like. So I'm going to stop this here because I've been going on for 30 minutes and I got to get my kid out of bed because he's a teenager and he'd sleep till noon if I let him. So it's 10 o'clock here where I am. I need to start cleaning my house for the day. But thank you guys. Thank you so much for joining me. I love your recommendations on topics to talk about in the future. I'll try to post some of the book recommendations as well. And we'll just kind of go from there. So thank you so much for joining me. And until next time.